Live. Yes, live. All right. Welcome, everybody, to a Friday live stream. And I have with me two versions of Alexander. The first version is the pixelated version. And the second version of Alexander, in about maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes, will be the full high quality, high definition Alexander. So from the pixelated Alexander in London, how are you doing, Alexander?
I'm very well. I mean, great again to be on the show. I'm sorry about being pixelated. It's nothing to do with me. I mean, I don't, and it's nothing as far as we can work out to do with our with the whatever device we're using. I mean, we tried Riverside, we've tried whatever StreamYard, and it always seems to come out like this. So there must be something going on which we don't really understand exactly, but there it is. But regardless, I think you can all hear me, and presumably you can all see at least some of me, and I am absolutely here and very delighted to be here too.
Yeah, your audio is great. Your picture will clear up. We know that, but all right, it's good to have two versions of you here with us. Alexander, hello to everyone that is joining us for the live stream. Welcome wherever you are in the world. I am seeing Holland. I'm seeing Ireland is in the house. I'm seeing Belgrade is in the house. New York is in the house. Zariel, Switzerland, moderator in the house. Welcome, Zariel. I see that Russia is in the house. Cosmic Rain is a moderator as well in the house. Thank you to our moderators to help keep the chat moving smoothly along. Really, really appreciate it. And Alexander, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about what's going on in the world, and let's talk about a part of the world that not many mainstream media channels talk about, but they should talk about it, because this week, Alexander, we had a ton of activity in and around Eurasia. You could say Middle East, Europe, Eurasia, Southeast Asia, the Caucasus, a lot of stuff going on. And before you get started, Alexander, let's just give a quick shout out to everyone that's on Locals on the chat in Locals, the Duran.locals.com. There are a lot of people chatting there as well and following this live stream there. So Alexander, Eurasia rising. I don't know about rising, but definitely Eurasia very active.
Absolutely. Eurasia is very active. I mean, rising perhaps, but definitely coming together in some form. And, you're absolutely right to say that very few people seem to be aware of this. If you go to the media here in Britain, if you go to the media in the United States, read the Washington Post or the New York Times, or go on to MSNBC or any of these places and see how often they use the word Eurasia. Barely at all. It's as if this isn't really happening, even as it is happening. And it reminds me of something that used to happen, a couple of years ago when we started the Duran. And it was all about, if you remember in those days, Russia, the threat from Russia. The United States is overwhelmingly focused on Russia. And we were saying on the Duran, right, all those years ago when we first started, the United States is taking its eye off the ball, doesn't really have to worry about Russia. It is China that is its ultimate challenge. And not only is China the ultimate challenge, but the way things are working out, the way they're doing it, they're going to push Russia towards China, and China and Russia closer together. And then suddenly, around this year, maybe a bit last year, the pin finally dropped in Washington, and you're starting to get the sense that they're facing a strategic crisis. I was just, interestingly, before we did this program, before, in fact, I even knew that, fully the whole topic of discussion, I was reading an article in the National Interest, which is one of these enormously tedious magazines. Sorry to say that if anybody who is on the National Interest writes about this, but one of these tedious magazines that the United States foreign policy community just churns out. There are dozens of them, which pretends to be more realistic than some of the others. And it talks about the fact that the United States is now facing a strategic crisis because of the way in which the Chinese and the Russians have been converging. Now, that's something we were talking about, 5 years ago. And now suddenly they've woken up to this. And of course, what's happening is that alongside that process of the Chinese and the Russians sorting out their differences, working together, holding military exercises together, coordinating with their leaderships all the time, all that sort of thing, we see how the Chinese and the Russians are weaving in Eurasia a whole network of states and structures that not just bind them, the two of them together, but bind their region together. And importantly, and I think this is the key thing for the Chinese, give China strategic depth. It means that China will not be so dependent on seaborne trade in future for its raw materials, because it will be able to turn to this vast region to the north and west, which is abundant in these kind of raw materials and which can supply them to China. And that will give China a degree of strategic depth, which at the moment it still doesn't fully have. So again, this topic which we are discussing today, I predict that in 5 years' time, if things continue as they're continuing to do, we're going to see massive discussions about this in the media, at least in the foreign policy magazines like National Interest and whatever, and they will eventually catch up with the position we're taking. And that's what's happening now. What you're absolutely right in saying, the activity is just frenetic. We've had that important meeting in Dushanbe, which brought all of the various leaders of this region together, including, by the way, Narendra Modi of India, who's sitting on the fence at the moment. He's not quite sure which way he's going to jump. I think this is something which Americans don't understand. I think they assume that India is on side with them, and it's far from being the case that it really is. But we saw all of the other leaders coming together. We saw all kinds of agreements, discussions, debates.
You mean the SCO, right?
The SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We saw Iran being admitted into the SCO. We saw a committee being set up within the SCO to deal with Afghanistan. And we've seen, of course, also all kinds of other moves about, Azerbaijan, where the Iranians are carrying out their exercises and all sorts of things. And of course, this meeting between Putin and Erdogan in Sochi, and there's meetings of this sort going on all the time now. And by the way, Putin and Xi have just had another big conversation with each other. So all this diplomacy is going on, and it's going on almost unnoticed. I mean, we are utterly oblivious to this. People are totally obsessed with the sort of micro subjects, if I can put it like that, of the political conflicts in the United States. One has to be so careful now what one says about all of these things, but we all know, the investigations about a certain event which took place in January. I'm sorry to be so careful, but YouTube is being particularly tough at the moment, so I have to be particularly careful. And we see all of these controversies and all of these discussions, and the big picture, the big events, the ones that the United States really needs to be concerned about and think about hard and decide what it's going to do, are happening off stage on a massive scale. Even the Saudis are coming closer to this grouping and are starting to distance themselves from the US, as again we've recently discussed in another program.
Explain what the Saudis are doing real quick,
absolutely,
because this is important.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's very, very important. I mean, first of all, they're having very in-depth negotiations with Iran. There've now been at least 4 meetings with Iran that we know about in Iraq, and apparently another one in Oman. They're apparently edging towards reestablishing diplomatic relations with Iran, and they seem to be working closer to integrating themselves with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They've just been granted partner status to the SCO, which means that MBS and King Salman will be able to attend meetings of the SCO like Modi does. And we've also seen the Saudis sign off a few weeks ago what looks like some kind of defense relationship with the Russians. So the Saudis are gradually repositioning themselves closer to the US, to the Eurasians and away from the US. And there's been all these reports about, the US missile systems in Saudi Arabia being pulled out, and, expect to see Russian systems take their place, because that's the way things are going now.
It's incredible news. What about a little bit about Iran, Azerbaijan, which is, we've done a video on that, but you may want to touch upon that situation as well.
We have done a video about that. Now, the first thing to say is that this is a sign of the new Iranian government led by Ebrahim Raisi, who's a hardliner, or at least, the West calls him a hardliner. I think he is, actually. Anyway, he's taking a much more assertive line in foreign policy. He's unhappy. The Iranians are unhappy about the fact that Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan are forming a kind of Sunni grouping, and the Iranians want to check that and to keep that in balance, and if possible even break it up, because they don't want to see a Sunni grouping encircling them, especially with Afghanistan now having been fallen to the Taliban. And at the same time, they are extremely concerned about the fact that Azerbaijan has apparently been working towards better relations with Israel. There's even some talk of Azerbaijan buying weapons from Israel. Iran is still locked in a very strong confrontation with Israel, and they don't want Azerbaijan taking these steps at their back. But, there's also, and this is perhaps the general story, Iran reasserting itself in the region. Azerbaijan, by the way, once upon a time, hundreds of years ago, was part of the Persian Empire. So, they have those kind of connections. And Iran used to be a major player in the Caucasus until it was driven out of the Caucasus by Russia. It has very friendly relations with Armenia, historically close relations with Armenia. There's a large Armenian diaspora in Iran. So Iran is now asserting itself in the Caucasus. It's reminding everybody there that it's a player, that it's an important factor in Caucasian politics. And it doesn't want Azerbaijan getting too close to Turkey, too close to the other Sunni states, and certainly doesn't like it getting too close to Israel. So that's the play that Iran is making, and it's a strong one.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat. Is Azerbaijan majority Sunni or Shia?
Do you know? I'm not absolutely.
They say it's majority Shia, but
yeah,
it is aligned with Turkey, which is.
I think it is majority Shia, but I should say also that the language of, bear in mind, as I said, Azerbaijan used to be a part of the Iranian world, which of course would make it inclined to Shiism. But of course, the government there is secular, and the language that is spoken in Azerbaijan is a language very close to Turkish. In fact, Armenians sometimes call Azerbaijanians Turks, which, by the way, the Azerbaijanians resent and don't like. And I understand that Azerbaijanians and Turks can actually understand and talk to each other without very much difficulty. So, there are those ethnic, linguistic, cultural links to Turkey, which is, of course, Azerbaijan's big ally. And, of course, Azerbaijan has linked up with the Sunni states, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and that's making the Iranians nervous.
Yeah, Dublin TV says overwhelmingly Shia, and Space Water says Shia majority, but sectarism is not too rigid.
No,
so yeah.
It's a secular. It's a secular.
Yeah.
But then so is Turkey in theory.
Yeah, completely connected to Turkey. Completely connected to Turkey. I think it's not a stretch to say that at all. Alexander, before we get some questions that are coming in from the super chats, and before I ask you the questions, everybody hit that like button on your way in. Let's get this video out there. And the Biden administration, they simply cannot deal with the way things are moving in Eurasia. I mean, the pace of things. They're not capable of it. They need to stay on their identity politics, woke, Kuf agenda. Otherwise, they're just going to fall apart. In other words, it's not a matter of the U.S. engaging in that area. I just don't think the Biden administration, the U.S., has the capacity to engage at this moment.
More to the point, I think that's the conclusion that the countries in the region have also come to. I mean, when we did that program yesterday or the other day about Saudi Arabia's moves, you made a very astute point. I mean, I didn't think that program's come up yet, but you made a very serious and very good point that it's the Middle East that's giving up on the United States more than the United States is giving up on the Middle East. And I think that is exactly right. I think that's exactly what we see. I think that the Middle Eastern powers are looking at the Biden-Harris administration, as we are apparently asked to call it, and they say to themselves, well, realistically, given the choice, the Russians and the Chinese have their act together, the Americans don't. So, we're going to go with those who are strong, clear-sighted, and have something to offer when the Americans don't and aren't up to dealing with these problems anymore.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the questions in the live stream, and Alan Watson wants to know about Egypt and the Suez. What importance does Egypt now play in the way things are shifting? How are you looking at Egypt?
Egypt's a very important country, and by the way, we haven't yet done this program, but the Egyptian President El-Sisi, is again talking increasingly about the existential threat to Egypt from the Ethiopian dam projects. We'll come to all of that eventually. But Egypt is a very important country in the Middle East. It's the biggest Arab country by far in population terms. It has an industrial base. And of course, it too has historically been an ally of the United States, but it too has increasingly good relations with China and especially Russia. Al-Sisi has very good personal relations with Putin. And Egypt is also a close ally of Saudi Arabia. So you see how all of these things interconnect. Egypt, by the way, though being a close ally of Saudi Arabia, has also taken a very skeptical view of the insurgency in Syria and has tended to be more sympathetic to the Assad government than some of the other Arab states have been. After all, Al-Sisi came to power in reaction against the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt. And obviously he is very opposed to seeing the Muslim Brotherhood or any entity like that establish itself in Syria. So Egypt is the most powerful military state amongst the Arab states, I think. I think it's fair still to say that. It's a big industrial power, has an active diplomacy. It has massive problems. And I mean, we can talk about those at great length, but I mean, it's got enormous economic problems. There's all sorts of issues about Egypt and the poverty there and the corruption there, but that doesn't stop the fact that Egypt remains a pivotal power. As for the Suez Canal, I think that's becoming less important to international trade than it once was. I mean, if you go back to the 50s and 60s and that sort of period, then it was very important. I think it's become much less important today, but it's still important enough for people to be concerned about it.
Yeah, and Zariel says that we should not forget that India is in majority connected to Russia when it comes to military equipment. Yeah, and that India may not want to jeopardize that. But that's a good segue, Zariel, to talking about Turkey and Erdogan's meeting with Putin. Once again, the mainstream media just doesn't pick up on this stuff, but what a huge meeting between Putin and Erdogan. And Turkey is, if you had told me 3 years ago, Alexander, that Turkey would be shifting so much towards Eurasia, the SCO, Russia, China, I would have been like, you're out of your freaking mind. But it's happening every 3 to 6 months. It seems that, Turkey keeps on moving a little bit closer. When's it just going to say, we're done with these guys over here and we're moving there?
I think there's still some distance to go before that happens. But can I also say, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember 3 years ago when there were some people who already say, well, Turkey is gradually drifting away from the West. It's going to join the SCO. It's going to integrate with the Eurasian powers. I said, that's simply not going to happen. Turkey is anchored in the West. It's a strong ally of the United States. Erdogan is a rather unusual and difficult character, but it's never going to get to the point where there's going to be a break with the United States. And yet, on this one, I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I'm being proved wrong. What I thought 3 years ago would never happen, inch by inch and step by step, is happening. And again, why is it happening? Well, it's because I've got to say this. The US isn't handling its relations with Turkey with the kind of skill it once did. So Erdogan has this meeting with Biden in New York. It went extremely badly. Erdogan has said as much. He's not making any pretense any longer that relations between him and the current administration has become extremely poor. And the United States is not showing any willingness to understand Erdogan's concerns about US backing for the Kurds in northeast Syria, or the economic and other issues that are, so fraught in the relationship between Turkey and the United States. And of course, on top of that, though Turkey is still very tied up with the United States, it would still find it very difficult to withstand a sanctions war. Increasingly, its economic links are pulling it towards Eurasia. And we have now Erdogan announcing that he's going to buy more S-400 missile systems from the Russians, just to emphasize the point that that's where his real friends are, in Moscow and ultimately Beijing, rather than in Washington and Brussels. And that's something I would never have expected. And yes, Erdogan has played a role in bringing that about, but the Americans have played a bigger role, because they've been pushing Turkey away and doing it, I think, without really understanding what they've been doing.
Yeah, just say it plainly. Erdogan hates Biden. Biden hates Erdogan. But isn't it funny how that when the Biden administration, came into power, let's call it that, came into power, it was the adults back in the room, right? America is back. Diplomacy is back. All this stuff about the Biden White House getting back to the U.S. is diplomacy that Trump sabotaged and Trump ruined. And you have the exact reverse. It seems that no one wants to deal with Biden, or with Blinken for that matter. No one.
Absolutely right. That's completely correct. In fact, it's now starting to be noticed. I mean, I did a program for locals on our locals platform about a commentary by an absolute arch neoliberal humanitarian interventionist, anti-Russia hawk, anti-China hawk, Simon Tisdall in The Guardian. And he was admitting, he'd been a fervent supporter of Biden, and was saying that this administration is not working. It's foreign policy. It's all over the place. It's making one mistake after another. It's not managing things well. And, they were all saying last year that, we get rid of the bad orange man and everything will be well, or, the alliances will be strengthened, friendship will be reestablished, we'll put the wicked Mr. Putin in his place, we'll see off Mr. Xi. And it's the opposite that's happening. It's the Russians and the Chinese that are making the big moves, and the United States is all over the place. And when the Americans meet with the Chinese especially, they get hammered. And when they meet with the Russians, they get outmaneuvered, because they're just not adults in the room, whatever they may think they are.
Yeah. Let's see here. Boris says, the only way the Anglo-Saxon hegemony can survive is pitting Russia against the Chinese, like in the Cold War. Won't happen. Those days are over.
Absolutely correct, because, of course, as far as the Russians and the Chinese are concerned, they know their history. They know that what happened in the 60s, when those two countries fell out with each other, worked entirely to the advantage of the US. And let's give Nixon and Kissinger their due. I mean, Kissinger's an appalling individual. I can't stand him, and that's I'm using measured language. But whatever else he was a clever man, and he saw the opportunity in the 70s, and he took advantage, and he did work to the geopolitical interests of the US. You push these countries apart. What they've done instead is they've pushed them together. And now you're getting all these articles, these worried articles in the national interest and in other places saying, my God, what a mistake we made. And what are we going to do now? And not able to come up with any real answer or solution because of the kind of problem that, has just been identified. The Russians and the Chinese will not make that mistake a second time.
Yeah. The only answer they have is sanctions. That's it.
Well, the only answer they have is sanctions.
That's not an answer.
It's not an answer. I mean, it's not only is it not an answer, it's making the situation worse because, of course, you sanction the Russians increasingly. Then, of course, who do they trade with? They trade with China. Same if you do the same with Iran, and of course you can try and sanction China, and undoubtedly that will come. Let's be straightforward about it, but it won't have the effect that the Americans think it would, because we're talking about a Eurasian bloc which is self-sufficient, and that's what the whole point about it is. Coming back to that first comment that we were making at the start of this program, the whole point from a Chinese point of view about Eurasia is to give China strategic depth.
Yeah. AJ says the U.S. no longer has any senior diplomats of Lavrov's caliber. And C. Valdez says that Mexico received Xi during the CELAC. China is investing heavily in Latin America. Russia signed a deal with Mexico. I mean, they're just the point to all of this is they've got diplomats, but they're on the move. While the West is dealing with just ridiculous, dumb stuff, they can't figure out how many genders there are. These guys are, and that's the truth. They can't figure that out, and that's all you're getting in the news cycle, or they're dealing with coup stuff. You don't hear any of that stuff really going on in these countries, Eurasia and China. I mean, yes, it's happening, but they're still moving with their diplomacy. They're still inking deals, they're making business, and they're doing it at an incredible pace. And it's all over the world: Africa, South America, Mexico.
Absolutely. It reminds me, actually, of the United States that I used to remember. I mean, I remember that is what the US used to do. I know that sounds a strange thing to say, but you remember the US in the 60s and 70s. I mean, it was the US that was making all the big moves. It was, again, coming back to Kissinger, he used to go in a shuttle diplomacy, go from one capital to the other, signing the deals, making the conversations, getting people moving. And the US did have, in those days, outstanding diplomats. It had some of the best diplomats ever. And today, well, we don't see any kind of real diplomacy at all from the United States, because all of the people who were really competent at doing that sort of thing, well, as far as I can say, they've all been driven out because they're giving advice which their masters and mistresses in Washington don't want to hear. So that's the trouble.
Yeah, Rich says, the way Europe is going, it may cancel great diplomats like Camilo Benso, de Cavour, Bismarck, and great generals like Garibaldi, who changed Europe.
Absolutely. Well, there's no one remotely comparable to Cavour and Bismarck in Europe today. I mean, just looking at the situation in Europe. I mean, Macron, in his dreams, possibly, but nowhere else. Merkel, I mean, it's interesting to see, by the way, how over the last few weeks, the British media has finally turned on Merkel. There are still a few people in Britain who, continue to admire her. There was a sort of hagiographic piece about her in The Guardian. But overall, even the British have now finally tumbled to what a, frankly, waste of space Merkel was, and what a destructive figure in many senses she was. But leaders of the caliber, let's put aside Bismarck and Cavour. Let's talk about Helmut Schmidt or Charles de Gaulle or people of that caliber. Margaret Thatcher's first foreign minister, Carrington, for example. There's just no one like that today. I mean, we are so far removed from seeing people like that in charge. The best we can manage, it seems, in Europe is Josep Borrell, who tells Lavrov, "Stay out of Africa; it belongs to us." I mean, it's just crazy stuff. And I mean, Liz Truss, who's now become Foreign Secretary in Britain after having been International Development Secretary. I mean, these sort of people who are just really not up to the standard of international diplomacy today.
Did you catch Lavrov's speech at the UN, Alexander? He had some tough words for Europe and the US, and I mean, he just laid into them. Basically, he was just like, don't stop dividing the world, stop positioning people jabbed and not jabbed, passports, no passports, democracies, not democracy. I mean, he just laid into the entire deep state, the entire swamp, it seemed, in New York.
Yeah, I mean, he's become the hard man of the Russians and the Chinese. Where they really want to send somebody out to actually do to make the real points, the really heavy points. They send Lavrov. I mean, he's the mailed fist in the mailed glove. If I can put it like that. I mean, that's his role. I mean, Putin recently said that he's no longer the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's the Minister of almost the Minister of Defense. He's taking such a strong line, but he remains a consummate diplomat. You only have to look at his various discussions with various leaders from around the world. His recent conversations with the Vietnamese foreign minister, who recently visited Moscow, for example. You see how skillfully, when he has to be a diplomat, he does that. But what he's increasingly doing is he is doing what his job, it seems, is to provide an intellectual response, an intellectual counter to the ideologies that have the West at the moment in their grip. And that's increasingly what he's doing. He's the person who articulates these things on a sort of regular basis. Putin sometimes weighs in too, but it's Lavrov's job now to argue these points at the level of the General Assembly, the Security Council, in his interchanges with Josep Borrell. They apparently had a furious row the other day. The two men obviously dislike each other intensely, but in all kinds of other venues too.
Yeah. Any opinions on this Moscow Times article? Kremlin looks to establish a techno-authoritarian power vertical 2.0. Centralization, good or bad? This is from Command Unit. Moscow Times. Oh boy.
Well, the Moscow Times. I haven't read that article, but I mean, it's fascinating that they talk about a power vertical, because they've been talking about this power vertical that is about to be established for the last 20 years. I mean, every single article that I've read. There's even I think even the editor. I may be wrong about this, but I believe that the editor of Moscow Times, or a former editor of Moscow Times, actually has a blog which is called the Power Vertical. The expression, by the way, originates from something that was said at the time when there was the transfer of power from Yeltsin to Putin, which is that they needed to create a vertical of power, in the sense that what had existed before in Russia was just chaos, in which everybody did whatever they wanted, and in which lower level officials simply disregarded instructions that were sent to them from higher ranking officials, which didn't create a structured system of governance. It created a chaotic one. So they needed to create a vertical where people understood that there is a structure and a process that they must follow, and that's absolutely basic common sense. And people like Moscow Times have reinterpreted to mean something, not just sinister, but utterly deranged. The fact of the matter is, let's not be naive about Russia. Russia is a country with a very powerful government. It's got all the same principles that governments around the world has. It wants as much control as it can get. It will always come up against the same kind of resistance that governments that try to exert control will always come up against. And there's always that tension within society. I mean, let's not be naive. Let's not make the Russians better than they are. Let's not pretend that Mr. P is, this libertarian figure that some people imagine him to be. But what I will say is this: the Russians also understand, perhaps better than most, that you can't push society too far. So the government will probe, it will experiment, it will come up with new technical things, it will try and do various things like that, but it will always understand that it has to accept that there is within society a very high degree of privacy and autonomous space. Now, the other thing, and I stress again, I haven't read this article, but the other thing I suspect is driving this article is concern that the Russians are step by step moving towards reining in the big American tech companies and are out to establish sovereignty over their own media
companies as well.
Media companies, exactly. And bear in mind, Moscow Times is to a very great extent Western owned. So I mean, I suspect that there is part of that there at play too.
Exactly.
So bear that in mind also.
You nailed it. You nailed it. And everything that just happened the other day with RT and with YT and Germany and Russia and Margarita Simonyan saying it's a media war. She said it. That's her quote. It's a media war. That is exactly why they're coming up with articles like this, because the Moscow Times, actually, I believe it's fully foreign owned. If I'm not mistaken, from Finland.
I think it's Finland. I think it's Finland. I think it's Finland, dude. I haven't followed its latest iterations for some time. I mean, I do look at it from time to time, but but that's its agenda anyway, and it certainly has foreign connections.
Yeah, the worry is the retaliation from the Kremlin of everything that happened. It might not just be Germany. They might, the Kremlin, they could surprise everybody, and they may take down all kinds of foreign outlets and English-speaking channels, and God knows what. Who knows what they'll do? But we'll see. They may not do anything, but we'll see.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You've cleared up, by the way, Alexander.
Oh well.
So now we've got the high definition Alexander in the house. All right, and let me go to locals and see what they're saying on the live stream on the chat. In locals, they're saying that Iranians in Iran and outside of Iran are suffering. That is what Evgeny says about the U.S. sanctions.
Oh, yeah.
And Jeff is saying that U.S. suffers from strategic narcissism. H.R. McMasters says it a lot about other American leaders without recognizing it in himself. And Leafy Bug says that it seems to me that the U.S. has been playing with such a strong hand for so long that it no longer plays with any skill, while the Russians have learned to play a persistently weak hand expertly. That's a great point.
I think that is an outstandingly good point. I think the fact of American power being so great for so long has made, I'm afraid to say this, Americans, or at least foreign policy Americans, both overambitious, not accepting that there's any limits on power, and complacent and lazy about how they manage that power. The Cold War, when the United States was pitted against the Soviet Union, was an educator. It did mean that the Americans had to work very hard to keep the Soviets at bay. And it gave them kind of discipline and a structure, which I'm afraid in the last 30 years they've lost. And I hope they rediscover it, but little sign of that at the moment. And the other points, outstanding points too, I should say.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Flying Boar says, where's that super chat right there? Flying Boar says, are the Europeans worried that Russia further integrated with China?
Well, they should be.
Europeans.
They should be. I mean, some are. Macron, from time to time, comes up with statements which suggests that he's aware of this problem. I don't get the sense that most Europeans think that far to be straightforward about this. Bear in mind, if you're talking about the Germans, I mean, there are many Germans who want to integrate with China themselves. So why should they object to the fact that that Russia is? I'm being perfectly serious about this. There's a very, very big German investment in China and in China relations. When I was in China some years ago, I was surprised at how many Germans were there. Actually, they were all over the place, and from their point of view, if Russia's doing the same thing, well, we're not too bothered, and if the Americans want to get in the way, well, that's a nuisance. It's not something that we're going to rush with enthusiasm to support. But generally, I think most European leaders, the Brussels leadership, is so self-absorbed. I mean, people talk about American narcissism. If you really want to see narcissism in its full glory, go to Brussels. Read the kind of things European leaders say about themselves. Read what Charles Michel or Ursula von der Leyen or people like that say, and you will see how narcissistic these people are. I don't think they really can quite bring themselves to imagine that Russia really is going to align with China, because as far as they're concerned, Europe is so wonderful and so perfect, and so magnificent, that of course the Russians will want to realign with them. So, as I said, I think there's some people like Macron who are concerned about it. There's some people in Germany who take a much more realistic view of these things in the business community, but they have their own completely different agenda. But the Brussels elite just don't see it really at all and don't really understand it, and think that they can therefore be as horrid to the Russians as always, and that there will be no consequences.
Yeah, the unelected von der Leyens and Michel's lecturing the world on democracy. It's funny, isn't it? Anatoly, since we're speaking about democracy, Anatoly's super chat is the opinion on Aussie and AZ audit and its potential impact. The Arizona audit and its potential impact. Have you been following it?
I have been following it. I'm going to say, I'm going to be so very careful by what I'm going to say. I mean, straightforwardly, I think you should read the actual report rather than some of the summaries that you have been reading. It seems that there were 57,000 ballots, to which there is a question mark. That seems to me a very significant difference. And if you, of course, count the same ballots that have already been cast in the same way, well, don't be surprised if you get the same result. So, I mean, I hope I've given enough clues. I think at this moment in time, as I said, with YouTube being particularly careful, I think we have to be particularly careful. It's the sort of topic that on Locals and our other platforms, we can discuss much more freely.
Yeah, well, nothing's going to change in the immediate short term from all of this stuff. But what do you think is the long-term strategy in all of this? What do you think is the game plan by having these audits? I mean, you're not going to change the situation at the White House, obviously, right now. But what's the plan?
Well, there's two possibilities. Either one, it is to validate the election, to persuade people that, all these things that were said about the election are untrue. And that's certainly the view that the media is spreading, that this actual audit in the end vindicated the result in AZ. That's one. The other one, which I think is ultimately probably the more real one, is that ultimately it will actually increase concerns and make people more careful and make state legislatures more careful about how votes are conducted in future. And I talked about that article by Simon Tisdall in The Guardian. Now starting to see increasing numbers of articles across the media in Britain. I don't know whether this is true so much in the US. They're becoming very concerned about the midterms. And it may be that, these audits are partly preparation by one side or the other in advance of the midterms, either to vindicate what happened or, on the contrary, to discredit it.
Yeah, absolutely. The timing is there. The timing means something. From Amarit, the U.S. didn't damage Huawei in that it still has a 31% market share, whereas two U.S. firms have joined 9% market share and have declined. Huawei increased 2 percentage points in share also. Well,
I
I'll say this, Alexander, just before you go on Huawei. What it did do is it really did damage their handset business. They used to be the number 2, and they were about to be the number 1 in mobile handsets. I mean, they were surging. What happened with Huawei, all this stuff, whether it's Canada and Miss Meg and the various sanctions from various countries, or the decision to not work with Huawei on a handset level, not the modems and the equipment, but on the handset level, the customer facing level, it hurt them a lot.
I agree. I'm fully with you on this. In fact, I did a program about this in which I discussed the Meng Wanzhou affair and what's happened to Huawei. My own personal view is that yes, the company is still there, still doing well in its own way, but it is not the all-conquering behemoth that it looked like it would be a couple of years ago. I mean, as Alex has absolutely rightly said, it's been pushed back. It's no longer number 1 in the handset segment of the market, which is the one that people see. Its Western business, the Western part of its business has been eroded. But of course, and centrally, all those arrangements it was making with all those Western governments in Britain, in Germany, France, wherever, in Canada, to try to develop 5G networks, all that's gone. So I think the company has been badly hurt by this. It's not the same company that it was 3 years ago. Doesn't mean it's on the brink of failure, or that it's about to collapse, or that it won't remain one of the big players in the Chinese economy and the Chinese market. Doesn't mean it won't remain an important international company and a big presence, especially in Asia. But that massive, all-conquering behemoth that it looked like a couple of years ago, I think that's gone, and it's gone forever.
Yeah. Hunger says the U.S.'s strategic position today is the result of its ideology. Change the ideology, change the position. There is no democratic roadmap to accomplish this because elections simply don't matter.
I agree with both points. I'm not going to say much more. Well, actually, I'm going to say a bit more about the first. I mean, I also agree with the second, but so we have all these constraints. But on the first, I completely agree. It is an ideological foreign policy, an ideologically driven foreign policy. Of course, they don't call it that. They call it a values-driven foreign policy. But that is exactly the same thing when you take a step back and think about what that means. It is this ideologically driven foreign policy that has meant that the United States has lost that position that it had achieved following the end of the Cold War. It's been steadily eroded away, and now is being eroded away at extreme speed because it's driven by it's conducting a foreign policy that is values driven or ideological as opposed to realistic. And if as I always say, the alternative to a realist foreign policy isn't a cynical foreign policy, which is what many people say. An alternative to a realist foreign policy is an unrealistic foreign policy. If your foreign policy is unrealistic, it will fail. And that's exactly what we've been seeing.
That's what we saw in Afghanistan, plain and simple.
Absolutely. Well, that's perhaps the paradigmic example of that. That's exactly right. There's a brilliant article about this, by the way, by Anatol Lieven on the Quincy Institute's new website, The Responsible Statecraft, which is a funny sort of website, by the way. It's got some very good things and some not very good things. But on the point about Afghanistan, he's made exactly the point that Alex has just made, and he's provided examples from his own experience in the country.
Yeah. Rohan wants to know, or says, that Indians don't trust Americans, they trust Russians, but they know USA is needed against China. How will the future look like in such an important country?
I think this is quite right. I mean, I think what India wants to do is it's ensuring itself and playing a game of balance. I think the Indian leadership believes, I think with very good cause, that India is gradually going to become a great power in its own right. I mean, it may take a long time. It may take longer than the Indian government thinks, but I think that they want eventually, they're positioning themselves, they're maneuvering for advantage. On the one hand, they are conscious that China has become incredibly powerful. They have disputes on the border with China. They have the unresolved problem of China being an ally of Pakistan, which India sees as its perpetual eternal enemy. So they've got these concerns about China, and they're real ones. So that inclines them to reinsure with the United States, so that if things with China for India go badly wrong, if there's, say, a renewed war on the border, then they have the Americans behind them and they can call on the Americans to help them in that kind of situation. At the same time, they are very anxious to keep some kind of dialogue with Beijing. So Xi and Modi do meet and speak fairly often, quite regularly. In fact, there's a lot of angry rhetoric in India about China. There's a lot of angry rhetoric in China about India, but the two countries maintain their dialogue. They have their major economic links. And at the same time, as India presses forward with its security arrangements with the United States, is a member of the Quad, buys American weapons in increasing numbers, it continues to source most of its weapons from its old, long-standing friend, which is Russia, with which India has had a very friendly relationship, going all the way back to Indian independence. And of course, India continues to participate in institutions like the BRICS group and continues to attend meetings of the SCO. So you see the Indians play this, I think, give them their due, with a great deal of skill. They're playing this game of balance between the great powers as they maneuver for position and maneuver for advantage and look to their own interests. And that, in my opinion, by the way, is what any great power, any country should do. It should always work in its own interests. It should certainly not sacrifice its interests to some sort of obsession or to some sort of ideology, which is a very dangerous thing for any country to end up doing. And by the way, India has an exceptionally good diplomatic service. They have a long and very strong history of very good diplomacy.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the Quad, real quick?
Right. I think the Quad. Right. Let's talk about the Quad, actually, because the Quad is four countries. So the United States, Australia, and Japan are already allies. I mean, they are actually already allies against China, because that's the adversary state. Of course, Australia and the United States are exceptionally strong allies, but Japan is a strong ally too. So that's three parts of the Quad, and that's an alliance. That's an alliance system. So they're not part of a single overarching alliance, but they're all allies. They're all integrated with each other. They work together. India is different. India is not a member of any kind of direct alliance with the United States, but it does want to maintain a kind of dialogue with the United States. So it turns up at these meetings with the other three. It goes along with some of the discussions. It waters down the communiques. We saw that happen with the latest meeting of the Quad when the four leaders met. The statements that came out were much more moderate than some people had expected about China. And that was very much on Indian insistence. So the Indians, knowing that these three countries are allies of the United States, want to be part of this grouping because, as I said, it ensures them against China and gives them leverage over China. But they stop short at the point when they become an ally, an actual military ally, and where the Quad becomes an actual alliance. So I think it's useful to India. I think it's useful also to the United States, because it preserves a US dialogue with this very important country, which is India. It enables the United States to talk to countries like Japan and Australia and bring them together in one place and have dialogue with them, coordinate with them. But I don't think it's an alliance system so long as India is a part of it. And I think the Quad itself is never going to become an alliance for the reasons I've just set out.
Yeah. No Sense says the chance desirable, in my opinion, to a multipolar world appears to be melting into two opposing blocks, especially in the Asia region. How to avoid this trap?
Well, I think that is absolutely correct. I think we are at the moment in a world where we're back to two blocks, into a two-block system. There's the United States and the collective West. This is, by the way, the expression the Russians have now coined for the United States and its allies. It calls them the collective West. And of course, the Eurasians. I rather like the expression of the collective West, actually. But anyway, so we have these two blocks. But there is a fundamental difference, which is a difference in ideology. Now, you go back to the Cold War. There was a very clear distinction between the two blocks that were there. There was the Soviet Union, it was communist, it was the leader of the socialist world, as it called itself. It had a completely alternative vision of society from the capitalist, free market, democratic, as it like to say, world. You looked at these two and you said, either one or the other. You can't. There's no real overlap between the two. With these two blocks, there is much more of an overlap. I mean, Russia, for example, in my opinion, and I know the people are going to be shocked when I say this, many people are going to be, it has a much more democratic political system than many Western countries do. I mean, there is no official like Ursula von der Leyen laying down the law, who is, as Alex said, unelected.
I don't think anyone's going to be shocked. You have Draghi. Okay. You have an unelected guy like Draghi plopped into Italy. You have the governor of New York, Alexander, the same, the replacement for Cuomo. I mean, I don't think people should be shocked when you say that. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe people are shocked.
Accept. All right, accept it. But you can't easily say that there is a clear division in the two systems like there was. There is, in my opinion, high degree of competence in the one at the moment, not very much at the moment on the other. Perhaps the one side is running its affairs more effectively than the other side is. There's a very authoritarian policies in, well, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, in China. I mean, China I mean, I've been there. It's a very controlled society, more controlled than any Western state is. And that's true. But I don't think there is this division. There is this enormous ideological lifestyle schism that existed during the Cold War, despite some people's attempts in the West to create it, and despite some of the things that are happening in the West. And I think eventually this will fragment, and we will see a more multipolar system emerging on the back of it. We will see, for example, India and other countries start to assert themselves as independent actors, rather than actors that have to align themselves with one power bloc or another, as was the case in the Cold War. And I think the other thing to say, and here you really have to go back to the beginning of the Cold War. If you go back to the 1950s, especially the early 1950s, I mean, the US and the Soviet Union then were the only game in town. Every other major power center had been smashed as a result of the Second World War. The United States in those days accounted for something like half of the world's industrial production. No state today has anything, any level comparable to that. China doesn't, nowhere close. So given that is so, other countries are richer, they're stronger, they're more organized, they're much more powerful relative to the superpowers than they were in the 1950s and 60s. So that again gives them much more freedom for maneuver. And eventually, as I said, I think that out of this present system of two opposing power blocks, a multipolar system will emerge. And don't forget, China and Russia, I accept for the moment they're bound at the hip, but it's not impossible that one day they will want to go their separate ways. And I'm not expecting it now or in the immediate or medium future, but eventually in time, who knows? But the world will have to change an awful lot before that happens.
Yeah. You may have countries going their separate ways, people inside of a country breaking away and going their separate ways. The way things are going, I mean, the world is extremely divided. Absolutely. Right now, Alexander, extremely divided. And one of the things that's dividing the world, and this has to do with the super chat from Russell, is the coup, which we can't really talk about much. Russell, given YouTube's announcements, but your question, and I'll try to make it YouTube friendly here, is I wonder whether this panic over the coup might stem from who helped create it, being aware of its propensity to change into something worse.
Well,
so
I
don't know how much we could talk about the
very little. I suspect. All I am going to say is that all the people who probably know the answers are not giving them, and that applies to Beijing and it applies to Washington. I mean, I have to say, a couple of months ago, there was that comment from Biden, which I'm sure we all remember, in which he accepted or appeared to accept that a certain scenario, which had previously been told was incredible, there might be some truth to it. And there was going to be a report, and we were all waiting to see what that report was going to say. And then it turned out that he said nothing. I mean, it was completely bland. And then a little later, we had more information about who had been funding what in certain laboratories in a certain city in China. And I have to be so careful what I say, but it's absolutely clear to me that we're not being told, not remotely, the whole story.
Yeah. At the moment, I will say this, that we're talking about worlds being divided. It is interesting how, you go to different places, and as many people know right now, I am in Belgrade, and I was in Poland a few weeks ago. But you go to some places and they're just a lot more free than other places, and of course, it all has to do with the politics around the coup, not the science or the health around it. A lot of it's the politics. But we are seeing a divide in countries as well. Of course, we're getting all the news out of Australia. Some countries have taken an extraordinarily tyrannical position when it comes to dealing with this, and others have just been, let it run its course. And you are seeing, there is now a free world. There is a free world, and these places are kind of spread all over the place. It's not just one block, but there is a free world. And then there's a world where, you're scratching your head going, I thought that used to be a liberal democracy, but it's not. And I'm looking at the live stream. Some places like Belarus, people are doing their thing. Sweden, people are doing their thing. Russia, people are doing their thing. I can tell you here in Serbia, people are doing their thing. But you get images out of Australia, and you're just like, what the hell is going on? Or Canada, or even the U.S. Even the U.S. inside the U.S.
Absolutely,
you can go from one state to another and get different.
Absolutely. And if we're talking about power blocks, I mean, contrast the different policies of Russia and China on this issue. For example, these two countries, which are such close partners and whose leaderships are so friendly with each other, they've gone in absolutely diametrically opposite directions. And that's in their handling of this issue, at least where certain restrictions on people's lives are concerned, and you see that all over the place. And that's, of course, goes back to the issue that there isn't the same degree of ideological coherence and rigidity within the power blocks that there used to be in the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to say that Australia now is going to lecture the world on what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be a free country. Can Australia possibly do that ever again? But they're in the Anglosphere. They're in the collective West, as Lavrov has labeled them. Australia would be considered part of that bloc, but Absolutely. It would be impossible for Australia to lecture any country going forward about what it means to be a liberal democracy or to be free. Impossible.
Exactly.
And the same goes for the U.S. I find it comical when the U.S. is talking about elections in Russia. Really, Biden? You really want to talk about elections in Russia? I mean, it's completely upside down.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I entirely agree with that. I mean, by the way, for people who are interested in the Russian elections, we've done lots about that on our local channel. You can go there and see it, and I've done a couple of videos, exclusive videos there too, which we can talk about. Where I go into the granular details of these elections and explain why, in my opinion, they ended up with the result they did.
Yeah. Let's see. No Mayor says, after 1,000 years, the West is not the most powerful anymore, economically or militarily. There is now the term hyperpower for the China-Russia schema. Can the West accept this without a nuclear war?
Well, this is going to be the major problem. I mean, it is going to be very difficult for the United States, I think, to accept that it's not just in a position like it was during the Cold War, when there was another military power, the Soviet Union, which was analogous to itself. But you remember, during the Cold War, the Soviets might have been militarily strong, but they were no rival to the United States economically. Now the United States is facing a Eurasian structure, which is economically a serious rival. And that's something the US has never experienced at any previous point in its history. It's going to be difficult to respond to it, but it can be responded to. And I really have to make this point again and again. If you know your history, you know that this issue of power balance is very often misunderstood. America doesn't need to be number one in absolutely every category in order to, be a central player, a big player in the international system. What it needs above all, the single most important asset the United States has, is not the size of its GDP. It is its way of life and its political system. That is what has always drawn people to the United States. And that's exactly what it seems to me the United States is putting in jeopardy as it pursues power plays, which is precisely the area where the Eurasians have their greatest advantage. So it's sacrificing its greatest asset in order to play its weakest one. And that's it seems to be one area where the United States is going fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. Command Unit says that the Moscow Times article we were talking about says that it's not really what the Times article is about, the vertical power structures. But look, we'll read the article, and
we have to read the article. I mean, to be honest,
maybe we'll do like a locals or something.
Absolutely. I used to read Moscow Times, every day. I mean, it's a long time since I stopped doing so. Sometimes you get interesting pieces there. I mean, there was a very interesting piece a couple of weeks ago about the growth of the Russian high-tech sector and how, contrary to all expectations, I say all expectations, not everybody's expectations, but some people's expectations, it's actually developing rapidly and is achieving self-sufficiency. But so you get articles like that from time to time in Moscow Times, but you get an awful lot of other stuff which I frankly consider rubbish, frankly.
Yeah. Let's see here. Elaine says that the COOF is being used as a means to control the population here in Australia. I'm in the locals chat now. Alexander Jeff Rich says that maybe Biden-Harris is the disaster the USA had to have to finally puncture the strategic illusion that they are the indispensable nation. And Real Lot No Sense says that Trump might be terribly needed in 2024. The chance for a rhino-free Republican Party depends on the Trump momentum, which is still in full swing.
Well, of course, let's take the second.
Good comments.
Yeah, they're very good comments. They're very astute comments, and sometimes one is, that has to be right. That you need things to get really bad before they get better, because it's it's showing people how bad they are that actually galvanizes them and makes them start doing things which change things. The only question I have with that, the only problem I have with that is how bad must things become before you get to that point when things change? I mean, that's always the worry. I mean,
Does the government, and I'll follow up on your point, I'll ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do the governments ever take it back when there's pushback? In other words, all the power and all the pushing, all the ground gained by the governments, do they give that back?
Well, never willingly. I mean, that's not what governments ever do. I mean, governments don't willingly give up their powers. I mean, can I give it a very simple example? I mean, Western governments did various things during the Second World War in order to justify winning the Second World War. Those things might have been absolutely justified in their day, but it did mean that Western governments became far more powerful over their populations as a result of the Second World War. The Second World War ended. Germany was defeated. Did the governments cease to be powerful? Did they give away all the powers they'd accumulated during that time because Germany was defeated? Not at all. Governments never give up what they have won. They always desire control. By the way, I should stress, I'm not a libertarian exactly, but I'm a realist. Governments always ultimately want to extend their power and their influence over the society to the greatest extent that they can. I can never remember who it was, whether it was Franklin or someone else, who said that the price of liberty is perpetual vigilance. And he's absolutely right.
Yeah, straight arrow. I'm going to ask Alexander the same question. And hopefully it won't be a controversial question, but going off your point, Alexander, was Germany or Japan ever afforded after the Second World War the right to pursue a full sovereigntist approach to things?
Well,
I mean, they really weren't, even up to this day, they have not really been allowed to be a fully sovereign, both those countries to be fully sovereign.
Well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, Germany doesn't even have a proper constitution, as I understand it. I mean, I'm not an expert on German constitutional law, but I understand that the German constitution is one that the allies, the Western allies, basically created for it. And Japan doesn't. I mean, Japan also is constrained massively in what it can do. Both Germany and Japan have, since the Second World Wars, succeeded in carving out a certain measure of autonomy, that they are absolutely not sovereigntist countries in the way that they used to be. And that's the reality. I mean, it's the reality that many Germans and Japanese would accept and agree with.
Yeah, so just to bring this to today, Alexander, my question to you is, take Australia for example. When all of this is said and done and in the history books, will the Australian people ever get back the freedoms that they had in 2018, 2019? Or was that just an illusion?
Well, they can get them back if they fight for them, if they push hard and mobilize and win them back, but they won't be given back. That's the difference. I mean, you won't just have things given, but you won't return to what existed before simply, as a result of somebody saying, well, problem's gone, crisis has ended.
Yeah, exactly.
We can go back to the life that was. That's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. Yeah.
No. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all of this thing could disappear tomorrow. The snap of a finger, all of it.
Yeah.
The Australian government's not going to say, okay, it's all gone, it's all done. Now we can go back to the way it was in 2018, 19. They're not going to do that.
They're not going to do that. No, they never do. Governments never do that. And as I said, I'm not, a libertarian. I'm just being realistic. You look at history, and that's what history teaches you.
All right. Marit, in the 1980s, the U.S. caused Toshiba the same problems it caused Huawei and Alstom today by imprisoning its officers for selling equipment to Japan. Marit, interesting observation.
Absolutely,
Toshiba.
and one which the Chinese, by the way, are making. And of course, the Chinese are. I've been reading in the Chinese media the fact that Japan basically capitulated, whereas China has hit back. And the result is that China is in a stronger position than Japan was. And they're making the contrast between China and Japan. They're saying that by capitulating, Japan's economy went into a period of prolonged stagnation and decline, whereas by fighting back, China will preserve its economic position and its economic vigor. Now, I have to say that on the second part, that the Japanese handled things in one way and that failed, and the Chinese did it in a different way and that will succeed. There, I'm a little bit more careful. I think that Japan probably didn't have many choices in the 1980s. It didn't have the room for maneuver that China does. And I'm not, by the way, as sure that things are going to turn out wonderfully well for China. That they will turn out so much better in the end than they did for Japan. I think Chinese economy will continue to grow. I don't think we're going to see the kind of stagnation that Japan has experienced. But then I don't think China today is anywhere near to being as rich as Japan was in the 1980s, and the economy isn't matured, and there are too many differences. That's the point I want to make. So, the lessons that the Chinese are drawing are valid ones, but I suspect they can be taken a bit far. And I would just quickly, finally say that I think that there is a narrative, which is a powerful narrative, and which I accept to a very great extent, about the Plaza Accord, the idea that the Americans pushed the Japanese into all kinds of economic reforms at this meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York, a hotel, by the way, which last I knew was being renovated. But anyway, another story. And that this was the point where Japan, from being the advancing economy, things began to go wrong. I'm not saying that isn't correct, but I don't know that it is correct. I don't have that granular knowledge of Japan that will be able to make me give an informed opinion about it. And I do tend to find that sometimes things are more complicated than they are made to appear, and that it might be a bit unfair to blame the United States for Japan's post-1980s economic problems. So just making those observations, but certainly the Toshiba Alstom episodes do make an interesting comparison. By the way, Toshiba, the reason the US went after Toshiba, as I remember, was because Toshiba had done several deals with the Soviets, and the US said that Toshiba's deals with the Soviets had compromised US security and violated US laws. So some things never seem to change.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. From Leafy Bug in Local says, I think people are over-egging the pudding when it comes to the Australian response to the coup. There's coup madness here, but it's not greatly different from that in the US or Europe. There has been craziness everywhere. In the US, toddlers are masked. In the UK, millions went out onto their doorsteps to clap for the NHS. These are not normal times. And Turia says that I live in Hungary and everything here is normal. And Leafy Bug says I live in Western Australia and everything is mostly normal here.
I accept that. I accept all the points that have just been made, actually.
Yeah. Tucker Carlson did a segment last night, and he did point out the difference between Western Australia and Eastern Australia. And he noted that in Western Australia, things do seem very everyday normal, but in Eastern Australia, he said it does not seem normal. So Tucker Carlson also realized that last night in his opening segment. Kevin Dorr wants to know, this is a good one, what about the pet brass showing up to Congress and some GOP types having some sound bites, but no repercussions for the Afghan pullout? Absolutely no cutting budgets or holding up promotions. GOP is a joke. All bark. Not only that, Alexander, today, I don't know if you heard the news about the Afghan Marine, a U.S. Marine in Afghanistan, who rescued a baby in all the commotion. He actually made a speech at a Trump event, and now he's being investigated by the military
there you go.
for making a speech at what is considered to be a political rally. How about that? The hypocrisy is just out of
absolutely
out of this universe.
Can I just say that one of the fundamental aspects of democracy is accountability. If you don't have accountability, you don't have democracy. I mean, the two absolutely go together. Without accountability in a democracy, it ceases to be a democracy. Well, where is the accountability here? None. The wrong people are being pursued a person who comes and talks and says things probably with great sincerity. A soldier, he's being pursued. A general who messes up, well, he just gets promoted. But that's the way the world is. I mean, if you want to rise to be chairman of the IMF, you mess things up the way Christine Lagarde does. If you want to be a head of, president of the European Commission, you are the worst defense minister that Germany has ever had, and you rise that way. I mean, this is the extraordinary reality of our present system, that people who fail succeed, and people who succeed are hammered down. It's most odd.
That's the formula. You fail your way up to the top. That is the exact formula.
And then we're surprised that the Eurasians, who do run things rather differently in their societies, seem to do rather better. I mean, this is the reality.
How do you get a Secretary of State like Blinken? It's that simple.
Well, indeed.
Or Sullivan, Jake Sullivan.
Well, indeed, absolutely. I mean,
you're not getting the best people.
We're not hiring the best people, no. Absolutely no.
Oh, boy. All right. The English loyalist says, I feel China and Russia are moving fast before an actual competent president will come in. That president will have little to no moves to make, I imagine, before a competent U.S. president comes in.
Absolutely. And absolutely. Quite true. I mean, how long does it need to take? How long will it take before the US gets its house in order? And what will have been, lost in the meantime? It comes back to that earlier point I made. I accept, that things maybe in the United States, people need to go through a process of disillusionment. But how bad do things have to become before they get better? It's the same question ultimately.
Yeah. Well, Anatoly says, rumor, unrealized wealth tax may come to the U.S. How bad? That means a tax on the middle class and the poor when they say a wealth tax.
Well, of course it does, because of course we know perfectly well that other people, the people who are really rich, they don't pay these things. I mean, this is how the system works. By the way, I mean, I should say we're talking about the United States. I was reading an absolutely apocalyptic headline in the Financial Times about Britain, in which taxes are rising, shortages are rising, supply chains are all over, falling apart, and again, it looks as if the government here is no longer at the wheel. It no longer knows quite what to do, and some of the most trenchant criticism I'm reading about the situation in Britain at the moment is coming from people who fought for Brexit, especially the intellectual vanguard, who said that the opportunities that it created have been thrown away because we are trapped in this miasma of bureaucratic bungling. Well, I hope that isn't right, but it did upset me, and it gave me a rather uncomfortable time when I was reading it last night.
Yeah, Brave New Perth says that Western Australia will enact secessionism.
Well, I hope it doesn't come to that, but who knows? I mean, go back to what Alex was saying previously, that societies themselves are becoming divided within themselves. What's remarkable, by the way, is that they're not just becoming divided within themselves, but leaders are dividing them. Again, I have to be incredibly careful what I say here. But again, I did and I mentioned this in a video I did on locals where I was a little bit more outspoken, but I said, so the rhetoric that's coming out from the administration at the moment and the way in which people are being called things isn't going to bring people together. It's going to drive them apart, and that seems to be so obvious. It's amazing how people don't understand that. Or at least
that was Lavrov's warning, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's Lavrov's warning. Yeah.
Well, of course it was.
Yeah. He comes to New York, and I think he made his warning. Stop. Put the brakes on all of this. Otherwise, you're going to get, something like what Brave New Perth is talking about.
Yes.
Linda K, thank you for your $10 super chat. And A Sanchez says, with China's very serious demographic problems coming over the next few decades, would it be fair to say that its window to challenge the West is limited?
I don't think so. I am well aware about these demographic problems, and I think that they will grow, and I think they are real. And I certainly think the Chinese economic growth is going to slow and slow significantly. But every economy, no economy can sustain double-digit growth indefinitely. And I think if it tries to, that's going to simply create all kinds of problems. I predict that in a few years' time, official Chinese growth rates will be around 3 to 4%, certainly not 6, 8, 10% that they're claiming today. But even despite these changes, these demographic changes, there will still be an awful lot of people in China. And I still think that China itself will continue to grow economically. And I suspect also that as population growth starts to contract, what you will see is productivity increases start to happen. By the way, it's happened in Russia. Russia has seen working age population contract, but there's been a significant increase over the last couple of years in productivity to sort of balance that out. And they do tend to balance that out. And then, of course, the other thing to say is about demographic change, that it's never linear. Populations fall and the policies change, they become more family friendly, attitudes change, people start having more children, populations can rise again. Viktor Orban has shown you can do that in Hungary, for example. So I believe has the Czech Republic. So, you mustn't take things as baked in the cake like that. But I repeat again, China's growth rate is going to fall. And that, I think, is uncertainty. I think even the Chinese leadership understand that, though they may not have acknowledged by the amount by which it will fall.
Yeah. The opposition parties in Hungary are going through their elections, and they're going to hit the second round now. So they're gearing up to take on Orban come April.
Absolutely.
They're
Absolutely. What we've discussed is there's going to be there is a major push right across Europe to squeeze out and silence all the dissidents. So there's a major challenge against the Polish government, and of course Orban is the big prize.
Yeah. From Simon, Xi's anti-capitalist actions will cripple the most productive part of the Chinese economy. Please discuss.
I don't think so. Because first of all, I don't really think they are anti-capitalist. I think this is a misunderstanding. I don't take much of this rhetoric about socialism and capitalism, including to the extent that it comes out of China, especially seriously, I should say. I mean, I think that they do talk about socialism and they do think of themselves perhaps as socialists, and they do engage in a great deal of planning. But I think that the kind of people who are being targeted by these moves are the very, very big industrial groups who, for various reasons, are being cut down and rearranged. But if you actually go into the granular detail of some of these policies, it seems to me that a lot of them, on the contrary, seem to be intended to support small and medium-sized businesses, SMEs, or SMEs, as some people call them. And I think that, on the contrary, I think that the moves that are being taken are partly intended to focus investment on the more productive sides of the economy rather than the more rent-seeking sides. But, can I just say something? That might be the plan. Doesn't always follow that it will succeed. Things can always go wrong in any country. And it may be that Xi Jinping and his planners don't have things as fully under control as they think. We just have to wait and see.
All right. Valley S is in the house. I just saw you, Valley S. Welcome. Helping to moderate is Valley S. Good to have you here. But Simon Ennifer wants to push back a little, Alexander. Want to bet, Alexander? I will offer 10-1 odds. China's economy is a super bubble. House price is 46 times annual salary with 200 empty homes.
Well, I accept there is a massive property bubble in China, but is that property bubble the entire economy? I doubt it. I don't think we are in a Japanese type situation. I think the Chinese government itself began to become increasingly concerned about the extent of the Chinese property bubble, and they've launched it. And I think that's really what it's all about. Now, whether they're able to manage a soft landing as they expect is another thing. We shall see. But I, on balance, still think that there's enough forward momentum in China to pull this thing through. And I think that, the Chinese manufacturing and other sectors are sufficiently strong to absorb this blow, which I think the Chinese themselves understand they have to take. So we'll just have to see. We'll see what happens.
All right. Mark Hewitt wants to know, no change in the US and the UK for at least 3 years. Will it be too late to make the necessary changes to the West to compete with Eurasia?
Well, it depends what you mean by compete. If you talk about competition in terms of achieving the optimally best living standards and developing our political systems and enjoying, the good life in our societies and having, our families happy. And I think we can compete. I think we can compete perfectly adequately. If you mean competition in terms of going around and rearranging the world and deciding, who governs in Timbuktu and things of that kind, then maybe we will be in more problems. But the concern I have is that we are sacrificing in the West those things that make for our societies to have a good life in order to achieve all that other ability to dictate things in places like, Timbuktu or, Afghanistan or wherever. And that's what worries me. And that's where I think we would go wrong. And if we do that, if we base our entire competition purely on power competition, if we fall into the trap of looking at this in power dynamic terms, then of course we will find ourselves outmatched and outclassed because they are organized and we are not.
Yeah. Ken Barber says, Vax, the shot heard around the world. Thank you, Ken Barber, for that super chat. And Rocky Lux says, wasn't it agreed at the Potsdam Conference that Baltic nations, which collaborated with the Nazis and Holocaust, would be militarily occupied by the Soviet without any stated duration? Now they are occupied by NATO forever.
I'm afraid I don't know. Once upon a time, long ago, I remember studying all of this and I could have answered your question. But nowadays, I would have to go back and look at all of these records and find out what actually was agreed and what wasn't agreed at the Potsdam Conference. I'm nervous to say that the Baltic states are occupied by NATO. There is a military presence by NATO in the Baltic states. Some people in the Baltic states oppose it. Some people, perhaps the majority in the Baltic states, support it. The Baltic states, or many of the people in the Baltic states, had very, very strong feelings about what they saw as the occupation of their countries by the Soviet Union. And, they fought to achieve their independence. They achieved that independence. They've aligned with the West. They've got the US and Western troops there. I don't personally think they should be there. I think it's a mistake by the Baltic states. I think it's a mistake by the West too. I think there are all kinds of problems with that sort of strategy. But I am nervous about using a word like occupation to describe this arrangement at the moment.
Yeah. Simon says that the property in China is 30% of its GDP.
Well, yes, but 30%. First of all, what does that even mean? Are we saying that all of that property, all that value, if let's say it were to fall 10, 20%, that would, what general repercussions does it have on overall Chinese GDP? I'm skeptical about this. I have heard these stories, I should say this before, about Chinese economy being on the brink of collapse because it's overborrowed and overspent and all sorts of things. I think China has the resources to deal with this. And I think China also has massive savings that it can deploy to control this problem. And it also has a government that I think has the means to control this problem, and I think it will control it. The days, as I said, of 10% growth or 6 or 8% growth are gone, but I think that expectations of China imploding and of a crisis there are overstated. That's my own view. And that's, by the way, I should say, I mean, I know a lot of people who have business in China. I know a person who was, the manager of a bank in Shanghai, and my brother-in-law has, been a business person in China. That's their general sentiment, that this isn't an existential moment. It's not a layman moment.
Yeah. Shifu says, will Africa have a superpower in the future?
Who knows? Not for the foreseeable future, though, because which conceivable country would play that role? South Africa seems to be very disorganized. Nigeria seems to be in a state of almost permanent crisis. Ethiopia is in a civil war. Congo is also in a difficult way. Perhaps one day it will have a superpower, but at the moment, I can't see one.
Yeah, I agree with that. Rainy Step says the most populist Australian leader just resigned. The New South Wales Premier just resigned, Gladys Berejiklian. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She resigned, Alexander, because she had some sort of, according to Sydney Morning Herald, some sort of private relationship with a disgraced MP, I guess. This guy, Maguire, and there was all kinds of money moving around. Anyway, she's now under investigation. She's out. Yeah. She is out from New South Wales. So,
well, I'm not. I don't know this, so I'm not going to comment.
That's pretty much the news. That's pretty much what happened. As far as that's concerned. We'll see if she's if she was acting in a corrupt manner. We'll find out after the investigation. I guess we'll find out if they want to tell us. Flying Boar says, this RT Deutsch banned. How will Russia retaliate? By banning DW Russian version?
Possibly. I don't know. They're saying they will retaliate. And at the moment, their principal target seems to be YT. They're also saying that the German government itself was involved. Look, we just have to wait and see how this thing works out. I mean, Alex said at the start that they might decide in the end to do nothing. It's not impossible. I mean, there's a lot of strong words at the moment, but I don't know what they're going to do.
When Russia retaliates, it also has a habit of surprising. When you have these scenarios, the Kremlin does surprise you in the way that they retaliate. Sometimes they retaliate against a completely different industry or in a different way. They definitely like to use asymmetrical tools when they can. So they may not even go after a media company or tech. I don't know. What do you think of that?
That's absolutely right. I would add something else, which is that it doesn't always follow that their retaliation will be immediate. I mean, the other thing is they can time their moves very carefully, and it could happen in 6 months, for example. So it's very difficult to say. The Russians are fairly adept at playing a game of keeping everybody guessing on these sort of things. And I suspect that's partly what they're doing at the moment. They're just keeping us all in suspense and waiting to see what's going to happen and to see what the Germans are going to do. I think the Germans are a bit nervous about this. That's my impression. They've been going out of their way to say that it was nothing to do with them, which I don't think many people believe, by the way. I don't think anybody believes, by the way.
I think you'd have a bridge to sell someone, Alexander, if that was the case.
Absolutely.
Amrit says, Japan leads the GAN chip tech next generation telecom, and Italy leads in the SiC chip tech electric car. And the US still manages to get the fake spotlight by the media.
Well, I mean, it's also... I don't know those details, those technical details, but I mean that's another thing to say, which is again, if you dialed all the way back to the 1950s, I mean the United States was not just the industrial leader in those days. I mean it was the technological leader on a completely different scale. I am just old enough to remember this wasn't the 50s, but the 60s, when people used to come back to go, from Europe. They used to go to the United States and come back, and they said, they're living in a completely different world, a universe there. And until very recently, it was still the case that the US was the undisputed leader in pretty much any field of technology you care to name. I mean, the way that lead seems to have been squandered and lost is astonishing to me. But I'm not a technological person, and I'm not able perhaps to comment about this so much. But the fact is, the fact that the Japanese are ahead in some fields, the Italians are ahead in others, that so many people are doing these sort of things, shows again how much more diffused and decentralized the world is today from the world of true unipolarity, which, as I said, was that of the early 50s and 60s, when the United States was just dominant in almost everything.
Yeah. Boris says, when will the U.S. get the first trans president?
Yeah.
Well, let's see if they get the first female president, Kamala Harris. Let's see if that happens in the next year or two, and
absolutely,
we'll move from there, I guess. If it goes according to Obama's plan, let's see what happens with Kamala. Brave New Perth. Will there be a war between Iran and Azerbaijan?
No, I don't think so. I think that this is all a theatre and manoeuvre, and I'm sure that there will be a deal done of some sort, probably on Iranian terms. I don't think the local powers, the big powers, Turkey, Russia, China even will want to see an outright war. So there will be a deal done.
Yeah. Brave New Perth also says, is there now a global jihad revival in Eurasia?
Well, that is, I know, something that worries the Chinese and the Russians a lot. And of course, they're worried about what's going to happen in Afghanistan. And of course, there are groups like that in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and potentially in the Caucasus. The Russians had to fight and win a very long war there, and in northwest China. I think overall, the Russians, Chinese, and the other states think that they have the situation under control, but they are taking many steps to reinsure that. And if you follow the news carefully out of Central Asia, there's been extensive redeployments of Russian troops, for example, across Central Asia, and security forces in Central Asia have been tightened at almost every level. So we'll see. I think that there is worry about it, definitely.
Yeah. From Shifu, why is the U.S. concerned about controlling the world rather than material quality of life of its citizens?
Because the power elite in Washington makes money out of controlling the world and has become very accustomed to doing that. It is much easier in some ways. I mean, this is the paradox of it. If you are a president or a secretary of state or whatever, to talk and do things in a place like, well, let's say Libya, then it might be to worry about the situation, the state of the industries in a place like Ohio. It seems easy to send your troops to Libya and to change things, and you get dramatic headlines, and it makes you feel powerful. Whereas trying to change things in a place like Ohio, the industrial sectors there, might require a lot of very hard work, extremely, careful management, consultations with experts, consultations with local people, can take a long time to do. And sometimes the political rewards aren't don't appear to be very great.
And the monetary.
And the monetary rewards aren't there. I mean, so that's the attraction. I mean, it's the attraction, if you like, of empire. Empire always appeals to elites because it makes them look powerful and it makes them rich.
Yep, it pays the bills and then some. Yeah. Evgeny says, Palestine and Israel has been awfully quiet lately. The new PM seems very sinister in his comments about Iran, and the U.S. doesn't really seem very enthusiastic about Israel. Is the U.S. support of Israel ending?
Well, we did a program about this, which I think is coming up fairly soon, in which we said that all the changes in the Middle East have actually worked against Israel, in the sense that Israel no longer can rely on the US to the extent that it did. There's a rumor flying around that the US has warned Israel that it will not support an Israeli attack on Iran. And at the same time, we've already discussed how the Saudis seem to be edging towards some kind of détente with Iran and some sort of engagement with the Eurasian powers. And that leaves Israel in a significantly weaker position than the one it's been in up to now. So I think what the Israelis are trying to do is they're trying to reverse that by again talking up the challenge to them from Iran. But if that doesn't succeed, they will have to think hard about what their other options are. Now, I think they've got lots of options, but at the moment, they're still, I think, very committed to their previous policy of trying to keep the focus on Iran and talk that up. Now, the Palestinian-Israeli issue may be quiet, but the whole story of it is that there's long periods of quiet and then short periods of intense activity and violence. And I'm afraid I don't put much faith in this quiet period that we're going through at the moment. After all, it was only a few months ago that it was, on the contrary, very violent in places like Gaza and wherever. So don't assume that's going to continue.
Yeah. Anatoly has a super chat which says, "Doesn't war help to solve economic problems?"
I think that is a misconception. I mean, this all flows, I think, from what happened after the Second World War. And it's a fact that sometimes wars can result in a strengthening of some industrial sectors. And the United States did come out of the Second World War, as I said, this overwhelmingly dominant economic power. But I think overall war actually causes more problems. It means that industries, for example, get diverted into military production rather than producing civilian goods. That undermines the position of the economy, of the particular economy on the international market, because it finds that its civilian goods are becoming uncompetitive. It creates trade deficits. Those can in turn lead to budget deficits. Arms spending can also, and including arms spending during wars, creates social inequalities and can concentrate wealth and economic and ultimately political power in few hands. I think that on this, actually, the Austrians, Mises and people like that, were absolutely right, that ultimately war is bad for economies and that the much better way for economies to grow and develop is through peace.
Yeah. Alexander, you have a lot of books in the background. Sixin would like to know, I would love to hear what you both think about the changes being made to definitions and the misuse of words in general. You see how I work that in, Alexander? Your book's in the background and the question.
Well, absolutely.
What do you think of all the words being changed?
Oh, I mean, this is extremely sinister and very, very disturbing. I mean, it's one of the most terrible things of all, because, of course, if we lose control of language, or rather, if language is changed around us, then that is a direct instrument of control. Now, that was, of course, what Orwell was talking about in 1984, but he wasn't the first one. And I mean, all the way back in ancient China, Confucius was warning about the changes of language, and he spoke about the need to rectify language, to give words their proper meanings back to them. So this is an extremely bad and very frightening thing. And the fact that it's happening to this extent in the West today, as all of these other authoritarian features that we've been talking about have been gaining hold, that is not a coincidence. That's absolutely not a coincidence. It's entirely part of it. If it's the use of language to control, and of course not just control, but change definitions, all the definitions, make us doubt that which up to now we've accepted as self-evidently true. Again, very careful what I'm saying, but there's been all sorts of discussions on certain, shall we say, identity issues recently, which which words are seeing their meanings changed. A much better expert, by the way, to talk this over with is my wife, who is director of English at a well-known university, and it's something that I know exercises her, concerns her a great deal.
Simon, on the back of that, that's a good question. Are we approaching peak Marxism in the West?
I wish.
How did the Soviets, the Soviet Union and communism deal with the changing of words, Alexander?
Oh, they did. They went into it on a huge scale. First of all, and always the very first thing they did, by the way, was a writing reform. They changed the alphabet, which is one of the first things, by the way, that revolutionary governments, especially Marxist revolutionary governments,
the Cyrillic.
The Cyrillic, they simplified Cyrillic. They did away with a whole lot of letters, which they said were redundant. By the way, the Chinese Communist Party in the 50s tried to do exactly the same thing. And you have simplified characters now, and apparently they're gradually being abandoned, but all kinds of things of that kind. But of course, they created, the Russian communists created their own language. And it wasn't just a language of control, but it was a language of messaging. And there was even an expression for it in the 30s within the Soviet Union. And it took from Greek mythology. They said that we're using the language of Aesop, not Russian. We're using Aesopian language. In other words, language which everybody supposedly knows what it means, but the words aren't exactly as they should be. And it was a very sinister development in early Soviet history. Gradually, as the Soviet Union got old and lost its revolutionary fervor, that began to change. But it was very much a feature of early Soviet history. And by the way, the Soviets coined the expression cultural revolution. They did that before the Chinese.
Fascinating. Interesting fact. I didn't know that about the Cyrillic alphabet.
Yeah. I mean, it's modern. I mean, because today's Russia still uses the Soviet Cyrillic, and I don't think there's any real desire to go back. But it's not the same as that of the Tsarist era. It's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
Dr. Pasternak, the writer of Dr. Zhivago, which of course he tried to publish in the 50s, he made a particular point of using old style Tsarist Cyrillic in place of new style Soviet Cyrillic. And in some ways, that was the most subversive fact about that particular book.
Interesting. Andy says, will they implement the Kuf passport all over Europe?
I don't know. I mean, there's going to be enormous resistance if they do.
They're trying.
They're trying, exactly.
Yeah, there'll be resistance. They're trying. EU, as far as the EU goes, I think they have an initiative. They've agreed, actually, at a conference in Brussels to go with the Kuf passport. I think that's already been hard-coded. But I don't know if each country is... Actually, I know that not all the countries are following suit. That I can tell you right now. Some countries are a lot more firm than others.
I agree. I'm sure that's going to be the case, and it's going to be difficult, but they will certainly try.
Yeah, they'll definitely try, but there's also going to be all kinds of technical just mishaps and all kinds of tech breakdowns and all of this. But let's see, Sparky. The most frightening aspect of the Biden administration is its most capable member may be Biden himself. Oh man, Sparky. You may be right if you look at Harris. You look at Biden.
I have to say, I think that's one of the wittiest and cleverest comments I've heard on a live stream. I don't really think I can add anything more to it.
Yeah, that is a very, very good observation from Sparky. Alexander, we have 2 questions on Nord Stream, 2 super chats on Nord Stream. One came after the other, actually. And Flying Boar says, update on Nord Stream 2, how Germany will certify the pipeline with the new government coming soon. And what's Olaf Schultz's view on this project? And then Simon sent a super chat which said the delaying of opening of Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long this is going to go on for. I mean, I think the important thing to say about Nord Stream 2 is that the Germans did drag their feet on it. I mean, it could have been finished sooner than it was, but the Germans went into this prolonged negotiation with the Americans in order to get it built. I think that eventually it will be certified and we will see the gas start to flow this winter. And I don't think it's going to become a make or break issue in the coalition negotiations, because it seems to be both the SPD, which is the party which will probably form the new government, lead the new government, and the Free Democrats, which is a pro-business party, want to see it. And I've seen polling data coming out of Germany, which shows rather remarkably that most Green voters and most Green members also want to see it too. So I think a number of people who are actually opposed to Nord Stream 2 is relatively small. But, the problem with Nord Stream 2, with this impossible, protracted saga, is you always think it's ending and it never seems to quite get there. So, who knows? But I personally think that it will be certified and it will be up and running before the end of the year, and all the business of the EU third energy package applying to it will have been somehow sorted out before then. But, we'll see. Because there is a power vacuum at the moment in Germany. And I think that's also thing to say. Merkel is still Chancellor of Germany as we speak. She is still there. She hasn't gone away, and she will remain Chancellor up to the moment when a new government is formed. In Germany, that could take months. After this election, it could take many months, because there are many differences between the various blocs. So, we talk about the SPD and the Greens, for example, and you can see certain compatibilities, but the SPD supports Nord Stream 2, the Greens, at least the leadership of the Greens, say they oppose it. The Free Democrats and the Greens have almost diametrically opposite economic policies. The Free Democrats want the finance ministry, and in fact, they're going to insist on it. How will the Greens feel about that when Christian Lindner, the finance minister from the Free Democrats, will veto all of the programs that the Greens want to see? So how will they feel about that? So it's not certain that we're going to see a government in Germany anytime soon. I personally think there's a reasonable chance that Merkel will still be chancellor by Christmas, and who knows, even beyond. But the reality is that she is a chancellor without power, because, of course, everybody knows she's going, and she's no longer even leads a party anymore. So what we have at the moment is a power vacuum in Germany, a power vacuum in Berlin, and it's going to make it very difficult for people to make decisions about what to do over Nord Stream 2 or anything like that. I think on balance, as I said, it will be certified because too many people in Germany want it to be. And I think for Germany now, it's become an issue of prestige as well.
Yeah, Merkel just does not go away, does she?
No.
My God.
No.
She knows how to stay in power.
Oh, absolutely. A stake in the heart is probably what's needed in this situation.
My God. My God. They have elections and she's still gonna be chancellor.
Yeah.
Incredible. Heyman says, when the Chinese stop imports, they threaten your income. When they stop exports, they threaten your collapse. I wonder if these power outages are a form of proxy sanctions.
Well, the Chinese are also suffering from power outages too. I think that's the thing to always say. Power shortages across northern China, some of them very severe. And the Chinese are now apparently asking the Russians for help with coal supplies and all kinds of things. Now, I should say, by the way, we're talking about the property situation. It's always difficult to know what to judge in coming out of China. And of course, the Chinese media is very controlled. But there is far more open talk in China about concerns about these power shortages in northern China in winter than there is at the moment about the property situation. So I'm just saying that. I don't that proves anything, but what we're looking at across the world at the moment are major problems with supply. The supply chains seem to be under enormous stress, or they're breaking down. We're seeing energy shortages piling up in many different countries. Right across the world, we're seeing energy shortages everywhere. Now, I think that there are multiple reasons for this, but there are two overriding ones. Well, three overriding ones. Firstly, I think with energy problems, I think we have followed, in the West especially, policies, again, I'm going to be very careful what I say, which have left our energy industries lacking resilience. I think we've overinvested in certain technologies like wind, which are perhaps not very reliable in particular climatic situations. And I think that's one thing that's playing this. The other is that obviously there's been major disruptions to supply chains because of the responses that we saw last year, which is still working their way through. You know what I'm talking about when I talk about responses. I think, again, our friends at YT might not be happy if I said that those responses led to problems. But I think we all know what I'm talking about. And the third thing, and I really think this is a very important thing, is that we have seen this this wall of money pouring through the United States financial system the first part of this year. I think that's caused a massive onrush in demand in all sorts of places. And at the same time, I think it's made some people in the energy industries and in the energy markets worry about inflation and engaging in all kinds of hedging, which is having the effect of pushing up energy prices even more, creating even more problems in supplies. So I think all of these things are taking place at the same time. And then there's local problems too, like the ones we see in Britain, where I personally think that some of the crisis here that's being attributed to disappearance of long haulage drivers is in some cases straightforward profiteering. So I think all of this is going on at the same time, and it's going on everywhere. And it's an enormously interesting and involving subject, but it's not, I think, been fully discussed and properly talked about. And one would like to see some granular studies and some more academic studies of it before long. But I think, as I said, it's these three things: undermining the resilience of our energy systems, the disruptions and the pressure on supply chains caused by the responses to, well, we all know what, and also this wall of money that we saw pouring out of Washington in the first part of this year.
Yeah. Cromer says some additional context on the power outages in China. Word is that it's mostly a result of government mandated controls on power generation to meet emission targets. Coal and oil prices are contributing to the problem, of course, but it's not an issue of shortage in energy capacity.
So you hear in so many places. But the point about these coal shortages and these energy shortages, that answer goes directly to the point I was making about resilience in energy systems. Certain policies have been followed all across the world in response to, the great overarching problem that we all hear about. Again, I'm sorry I have to choose to be so careful, but this is a time of cleansing, if you like, on social media.
Struggle session.
Struggle session, exactly. And these policies are causing disruptions which are not, I think, fully understood, were not fully anticipated by those who impose them. So in Beijing, Xi Jinping and his officials said, how are we going to reduce our carbon footprint? Well, we're going to do X, we're going to increase emissions targets, but they didn't think through the implications of what that might mean in a situation where, as I said, energy prices are already very disrupted and supply chains are disrupted already.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for the super sticker, Lewis. 2 super stickers. Thank you very much, Lewis, for that. Thank you, Ms. Parda, for that super sticker as well. And Cosmic Rain says, speaking of books, I hope Alex doesn't have anything naughty on the shelves, e.g. something rebellious. Keep up the good work, lads, as always.
I have lots of things rebellious, but I've got nothing naughty.
Yeah. Pretty soon, just having books on the shelves is going to be rebellious enough the way things are going. Alexander and Otno says, very true, Alexander, creating confusion about the meaning of words greatly undermines human cooperation. Understanding is based on mutually assumed conventions, forged through decent education in a coherent cultural environment, not on perpetually changing interpretations. Well said.
That's so beautifully said. That's absolutely correct.
Well said. Oh, no sense. And Flying Boar says, I'm not surprised that Merkel party lost because Armin Laschet is so incompetent and gaffe prone. Who makes Boris Johnson look like a genius?
Well, absolutely. And of course, you see, this is a good example of Merkelism in action, because, of course, what does Merkel do when she looks for a successor? She makes sure that whoever the successor is, it's not just one, it's somebody who is a little worse than herself.
This is her second go.
This is a second go. So, I mean, she picks, I mean, she never wanted, it's always the thing to understand about her, she never wanted anybody around her who projected authority and confidence and whom the German people might think could conceivably be a better chancellor than she was. So even though she'd announced that she was going, she still wanted somebody who she could dominate politically. And the result is she's created a desert within the CDU. And Armin Laschet seems to be an entirely emblematic figure in relation to this desert that Merkel has created. I don't think much of Olaf Scholz either, by the way. I certainly don't think he's anything he's going to set anyone on fire for any achieve any great things in Germany. I mean, nobody in Germany looks particularly convincing.
Yeah, all these guys are just bureaucrats and technocrats. That's how I look at them. Political bureaucrats and technocrats.
Yeah.
Cut from the EU kind of cloth, aren't they?
Absolutely, of course they are. Well, they're all loyal to it. I mean, that. If you're going to become a political figure in Germany today who's going to exercise state authority, you have to be loyal to that particular structure, because otherwise they will find means to push you out, and that's why the system simply reproduces itself. Only it reproduces itself every time in an inferior form. Worse and worse.
Worse and worse. Leafy Bug says you can have all the generating capacity you like, but if you haven't got enough fuel in your stockpile to feed the generators, there will be blackouts.
Well, of course there will be, absolutely. I mean, and that's entirely true. I mean, I don't want to go back to China, but I mean, in Britain, we've been running down our reserves rather foolishly, in my opinion. And I'm going to say this as well. I think, again, the government overinvested in wind power. I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I think they built lots of windmills in the sea, thinking that, windying Britain is always going to produce lots. And I was reading lots of articles by people like Ambrose Evans Pritchard, for example, in the Telegraph, saying, this is a wonderful project and how far in advance we are of everyone else. And I think actually what we've seen is it's created enormous problems of resilience in our British energy system. And I'm sure the same is true in many other countries too.
Yeah. Ernesto sends us a super chat, which says, what a marvelous morning are you giving you guys with this show? Thanks forever. A message from Chile, our friend Ernesto in Chile. Thank you very much, Ernesto. And all the best to everyone in Chile. And Flying Boar with a super chat says, update on the UK fuel crisis, which we're talking about. Will Russia come to the rescue and provide energy fuel for them?
Hardly. I don't see it happening. I mean, for the Russians to come to the rescue, the British would have to ask the Russians for help. I mean, to be realistic about it. And I have to say, I mean, the idea of Boris picking up the telephone and talking to Vlad and saying, Vlad, can you help me with some more gas? It's just not going to happen. I mean, this is simply not going. This is simply not going. We're not going to see it. I think the political class in Britain, if there's going to be power cutouts in Britain this winter, will still not go to the Russians to ask them for gas. What they will do instead is they'll run a big media campaign saying, well, it's Mr. Putin himself cunningly and wickedly cutting us off, and that's what they will do. I don't think they will look to the Russians for help. Now, the official narrative that we're getting from the government at the moment is that everything is under control. The shortages in the gas stations, the petrol forecourts, the petrol problems and the diesel problems, that they're all well on the way to being sorted. Next week, everything will be back to normal, and that we've managed to protect ourselves with gas supplies also for our electricity grids. Well, I hope that's right. I mean, I don't know that it is right. And I read, as I said, that extraordinary article in the Financial Times, which is, by the way, let's never forget, a strongly Remainer newspaper, which doesn't like Boris Johnson or the Conservatives. But anyway, it suggested, on the basis of what business leaders were saying, that it might not be right and that the government is being extremely complacent about this, and that the fuel shortages are not improving, and that they might even be getting worse. I don't know. Let's hope that they sort themselves out. Obviously, somebody who lives in Britain, I have a personal concern about it.
Yeah, Brando Commando says the U.S. is thinking of increasing sanctions on Ethiopia and Eritrea, and just claimed to have assassinated an Al-Qaeda commander in Syria. Why is the Biden administration focused on the Middle East and Africa?
Well, why is the Biden administration seeking all the time to impose sanctions on countries like Ethiopia? I mean, whatever you may think of the government there, whatever you may feel about the internal political crisis in Ethiopia, how is the United States imposing sanctions going to help in the resolution of that crisis? I mean, it doesn't make any kind of sense to me. It's just going to make the situation worse. And in fact, and I was hearing this from a person in the shipping industry, and that person told me that there are now so many sanctions, so many entities around the world that have been sanctioned. And bear in mind, if you sanction Company A and Company A has some dealings with Company B, and you are Company C, and you are sending a ship to a port where Company B does all the loading, then because Company B may not itself be sanctioned, but Company B has some contact with Company A, well, that might mean that you could end up being sanctioned too. And apparently, this is now causing real problems, and shippers are becoming really concerned about this. And they're spending enormous amounts of time now trying to do due diligence to try to keep up with this unending spread of sanctions that we're seeing coming out of the United States and indeed the EU at the moment. It's causing real problems, and problems which I suspect the authorities in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere are just not even aware of.
Yeah, well, look at the whole Huawei Meng thing with Canada and the U.S. It was because of all the sanction stuff, and Huawei is investing in a company, Skycom, in Iran, but actually they own that company. That company's been sanctioned, and now you have to detain her in Canada, and you get this whole incident where you end up with 2 Canadians imprisoned in China over it. I mean, the whole thing is just a complete mess.
It is. It's a complete mess. I mean, there's no single. You can't just go somewhere and get know exactly who you shouldn't deal with and who you should, because, as I said, the way it works is that it sort of ripples outwards, and it's apparently causing absolute nightmare problems for shippers right across the world now. It is actually affecting world trade to a much greater extent, as I said, than I think the people in Washington and London and Brussels understand.
I'll even bring it to a more simple level, Alexander. When you go to a bank in Cyprus and you have a company, you're going to start a company and you want to present the shareholders or the directors, banks are so scared to death of having one of those shareholders and directors be an American that sometimes just don't even want to deal with you. Why? Because they don't want to deal with any types of factors and regulations and sanction stuff and American citizens. I mean, literally, they're just like, you know what? Yeah. We just can't keep up with all the regulations and all the control and all the sanctions that are out there. It's just better to just stay away from it because it's such a regulatory nightmare, legal nightmare to deal with it. And this is a self-inflicted wound that the U.S. is putting on themselves. People just don't want to deal with this stuff anymore because you can't keep up.
No. Yeah. Anyway, as I said, it is a real problem, and it was discussed to me at great length, and I was surprised at how extensive it was, and of course, it's never one that's talked about. Always the pressure is to increase sanctions because it becomes almost like a kind of compulsion now.
Did they actually sanction? Did they get around to sanctioning Abramovich, the owner of Chelsea? Did they actually sanction him, or no? They pulled back.
But you see, what they've done is they haven't pulled back. I mean, he's now on this list that the House of Representatives has put together of people they want to sanction. But look what's going to happen, even though he hasn't actually been sanctioned. All sorts of people are going to be now very nervous about dealing with Abramovich, because they're going to say to themselves, well, the Americans now, or some Americans, have him in their sights. So sooner or later, this man is going to be sanctioned. So we don't want to deal with him any longer. But of course, what do we then do? Do we deal, if we're not going to deal with him, are we going to deal with any of his businesses, or the businesses that deal with his businesses? Are we going to provide kit, for example, to Chelsea?
For Chelsea? God, yeah. It's true.
I mean, it's true, but there is this problem, and there just doesn't seem to be any end to this. I mean, as I said, it's almost an obsession now. Sanction wherever you like, sanction as much as you can, and assume that somehow, achieves something. It does achieve something, but maybe the opposite of what you think it does.
Yeah. Flying Boar says, "What's with Europe? First, they don't want Russian gas, but then they complain and whine about Russian gas." It's so true.
Well, indeed. Well, this is enough. Let's talk about.
Let's talk
about. We can talk about. Let's look at European policy. I mean, they have a particular agenda in Europe, which we all know about. So they don't want coal. So European industries and energy mix used to be heavily based on coal. So they don't want coal. They've closed down most of their pits. Some countries, Poland, still use a lot of coal, but others don't. And so coal is out. Oil, well, we don't really want that either, because that's also dirty and has a big footprint. We don't want that either. We don't want nuclear power, because nuclear power is, well, we know all about how dangerous nuclear power is. And we don't have nuclear power. We have lots of windmills, but then, the weather is changeable. Sometimes there's wind, sometimes there's not. So how do we make the difference? Well, we import lots of natural gas, because natural gas has a much lower footprint than coal and oil does. And that enables us to meet our emissions. And then what do? We spend the last 20 years sanctioning, abusing, demonizing, criticizing our major gas supplier. And then we're surprised that things aren't actually good in our energy market. I mean, it shows in a way the utter illogic of this, about how they want to pursue one set of policies and don't understand that a simultaneous set of policies that they're also intent on pursuing are in diametric contradiction.
Yeah. Victor says Poland wants coal, but then I saw another comment in the live stream where it said Europe wants magic. That's so true.
Well,
their policy is literally, yeah, that is so true. They just want magic.
Magic.
Well said. Well said in the chat. From Simon, in 2021, the year globalization will die? Question mark.
I agree. Absolutely. I agree. I mean, we've done a program on this, Alex and I. We've actually even said that this is 2021 is the tipping point. It's the year when we could say that globalization is ending. But it's always important to stress that a lot of people, very powerful people, have not given up on it. And even though one can see now that it's realistically not going to happen, because we see the power blocks emerging, we see the economic blocks emerging, they're going to try and push as hard as they can to keep this project going, because, of course, ideologically and financially, they're so invested in it.
Yeah. Hey Man says, I suspect the Chinese power problems may be manufactured. They can selectively turn the lights off to a Toyota plant and keep Huawei factory running.
Well, who knows? And by the way, I don't discount the possibility that the Chinese authorities do exactly that kind of thing. As I said, I've been to China. I'm not naive about it. I saw how controlled Chinese society is. It wouldn't surprise me. Having said that, I want to make it very clear, I don't know that's the case. But if it is the case, I would not be surprised and I would not be shocked.
And Flying Boar says, recently Ukraine tried to sabotage Hungary gas transit. What's the update in that?
Well, the Hungarians are just plowing ahead, and they've given the Ukrainian ambassador a ticking off. But of course, it will all ultimately turn not on what what has happened over the last few days. It's what's going to happen in the elections next year. Of course, if there is a change of government in Hungary, then of course Hungary will swing into line. The contracts that have just been signed with Gazprom will be ripped up, and those who say to me that the Russians could then sue, well, the Russians have tried to sue Ukraine for money that Ukraine owes them, and it hasn't gone well because we've had all sorts of very bizarre decisions coming out of Western courts. So all those contracts that Hungary has signed will be torn up, and the whole policy will change completely. If Orban remains Prime Minister of Hungary, which I expect, by the way, and if he maintains his position in Hungary, which I also expect, then of course this could be a precursor of things to come, because of course we've seen that it isn't just Hungary, but Austria is also playing a role in all of this, and I suspect that's what's making the Ukrainians so upset and so angry.
Yeah, Cosmic Rain says, so do you think with what's going on right now is simply the elites doubling down because they know ultimately they will fail?
Well, they don't know that they will fail, but they fear they will fail, and so precisely for that reason, they are doubling down. That is exactly right.
And Heyman says, top 3 winners and losers of post-Kuf world. That's a good question. Top 3 winners, Alexander, post-Kuf, and the top 3 losers. Start with the top 3 winners.
I'm struggling to come up with an answer, actually, for that one, because at the moment, to be straight, if you're talking about political winners, I don't really see any, actually. I think any government has handled this well. I'm going to say that straightforwardly. I mean, looking around the world as to who are the losers, everyone is. We've all lost at some level. I mean, I can't see any. I mean, all right. Let's put it like this: if you want to believe in controls, then of course those who believe in controls, they've done very well out of it. If you are talking about certain companies which produce certain products, they've done very well out of it. I have to be especially careful, by the way, there. They've done very well out of it. Certain experts have done very well out of it. They're all over the media. Those sorts of people have done very well. Politicians, I don't see any politicians have done ultimately well about it. Even those who thought they would, I think they're finding themselves facing increasing problems. And the losers, everyone. Everyone.
Yeah, and it's hard to say with the politicians. You know, we could sit here and say that DeSantis has done a great job in managing everything, but there's another 50% of the population in the U.S. that is going to say, you know, he's the devil. He's the worst, and the same goes with Dr. F. You know,
exactly. Right.
Everything is so split on this.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Great question, though. Hey, man,
very good question. Yeah,
Alexander, I think we got everything.
Wow,
lots of great questions. Here's one from Flying Boar. Ukraine is barking at a wrong tree, Russia, when it's Germany that screwed them by convincing Russia to build this new pipeline. Absolutely. We've been saying that.
That's so true. We've been saying this all along. It's great to hear, Wild Boar, that you say that, because, I mean, it's so right. I can remember it happening. I can remember, Merkel rocking up in Moscow and telling Mr. P, I want a pipeline, just after, Mr. P had said, I'm not building any more pipelines to Europe. But she said, I need one. And of course, after a long haggle and much discussion, it all happened in private and secret. I remember in 2015, it all came when the announcement came. It came as a real surprise. And it was the Germans who wanted it, because she closed down all the nuclear power plants. She was having to use more coal. The emission targets were all going south or failing. So, of course, she needed the natural gas. And so she went to Mr. P, who she'd just been sanctioning, and said, I want a pipeline. And maybe I suspect, by the way, that somewhere deep in the recesses of his mind, he probably asks himself whether he made the right decision to agree. I'm not convinced that he thinks that this thing has been any great success for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think he regrets the whole thing.
I think he does. Yeah.
Flying Boar says Ukraine is being a burden on the EU. How will this project go on?
Well, good question. Well, I mean, the trouble with the EU, as we discussed so many times, is that they just keep these disasters running on and on and on and on. So if they can keep, the problems with the Eurozone going from bad to worse, presumably they can keep Ukraine going from bad to worse. The people who suffer are the Ukrainians. They are going through a terrible time, to be very clear. I mean, from having been one of the more prosperous parts of the Soviet Union, they're now either the poorest or the second poorest country in Europe, which is saying something.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the live stream. Wild boar, flying boar. Alexander, flying boar. We'll end it. We'll end it there. That was a great live stream.
It was.
Alexander, you covered a lot of ground.
Absolutely.
Well, a great chat, everybody. Really
it was.
Fun
It's a
chat.
Fantastic chat. Wonderful chat. We covered so much ground.
And Simon says, "Cheer up, guys. We are winning." Absolutely.
Oh, we are. Absolutely, we are. Definitely.
Any final words, Alexander?
No, I mean it's a fascinating topic. We'll be doing more live streams, and do also check us out on Locals because and on our other platforms too. I mean, I mentioned Locals because that's perhaps one where we're most active at the moment. But you can also find us on other platforms too. But the point is that all these problems that we've been talking about, this careful, measured use of words, well, that problem doesn't exist there. So if you want to have us talking more straightforwardly, well, you can find us there.
And Brandon said, "My boy Alexander's wicked smart."
Thank you.
I don't know if do you see the live stream as you're explaining stuff at all, or are you just so into answering the questions?
I'm so into answer. The answer is I'm so into answering the questions. Absolutely. I mean, I'm focusing always on the questions, which are, to be honest, I mean, very often, I mean, they're so stimulating that actually it's so difficult because you have this interchange. It's like a conversation where you can sort of flow. I mean, I love them anyway. I love these things.
Yeah, the live stream is great because there's a lot of great questions, a lot of great insights and comments as well. There's also a lot of good comedy. There's a lot of witty things that are being said. It's cool, especially in these times.
I know, and that's the other thing. The most important thing is that we retain our sense of humor and our capacity to laugh, because that's one thing the other side doesn't like and very much fears. They want us to be serious and worried and ponderous and solemn and all those things. That's what they are themselves. They have no sense of humor.
Exactly. You nailed it. Exactly. They want us to be like them. No, thank you. With the Locals, there's a question about Locals. It's a live stream. What I do is that you're going to get the live stream you see here, but on Locals, it has its own chat. So you get the same live stream. It's via YouTube, but you get a Locals chat. Yeah. And so, I'm going in there as well and picking up questions and comments from Locals as well. So it's a cool interface. If you want to catch the live stream on Locals, definitely check it out. A chance of a live event. Oh, I don't know if we would ever be able to put together a live event. Maybe if I get to London, maybe we do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Or Belgrade or wherever. I mean, sometime. I mean, we've done them before, actually. I mean, sort of live events, but well, not quite. But
in Greece, we've been together and we've done live streams.
Together, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
together. Yeah, when you've traveled to Greece.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
All right, we'll end it there. Any final comments, Alexander, before we enjoy our weekend?
We're going to enjoy a weekend of it, and we're going to be absolutely stimulated and enjoy it even more because of this fantastic chat that we've just had. And it really, I mean, seriously, it has been a wonderful one. It's a vintage one. We've had amazing comments and amazing thoughts, and some really clever and really witty and very insightful and profound comments too.
Yeah. No, this is actually, I'm in an Airbnb, so this is just a wall. There's no painting here. It's just the color of the wall. I'm in Belgrade right now, so this is just the way the room is set up. Let's see. Cosmic Rain, final super chat says, humor keeps our morale up and elite hate that. Much easier to conquer a demoralized populace.
So true. So absolutely correct. Absolutely true.
Cosmic Rain, thank you for moderating. Thank you, Valley S, Alan Watson, Zariel. Did I miss any other moderators? I hope I didn't, but I think I got everybody. Thank you very, very much, guys. Check us out on Locals, the Duran.locals.com. Alexander is doing all kinds of great shows on Locals as well, where he speaks more freely, as you mentioned in the stream.
Yeah.
So definitely check us out there, theduran.locals.com and Duran Shop. 10% off when you use the code Real News. We're both wearing Duran gear. And let's promote, Alexander, the new media, something RT doesn't do. You have a Duran mug with you over there, do you?
Of course I do. Of course I do. Yeah. Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Great.
Always.
And RT has not gotten on new media, and that's one of the reasons that they got dinged by YT. But we promote new media: BitChute, Rumble, ODYSEE, and Super U. Check us out there as well. Have a great weekend, everybody. Be safe, have fun, and enjoy yourselves. Take care.